Somewhere in the darkness, over 300,000 years ago, a human being looked up at the stars and, for the first time, wondered why. Not how to hunt, not how to survive the night, but why the sun rises, why people die, why we dream. That single question would echo through every civilization that followed, carved into cave walls, buried with the dead, whispered by shaman, built into towering temples of stone. Tonight, on Sleep Smart, we travel back to the very beginning, before gods had names, before religions had scriptures, to trace the quiet, human origins of belief itself. No arguments, no conclusions, just the long, slow story of how our ancestors made sense of the unknown. So settle in, dim the lights, and let your mind drift back to the birth of religion. Long before temples, long before prayer, long before anyone had a word for God, there was simply survival. To understand how religion began, we have to go back further than belief itself. Back to a time when the human mind was only just beginning to become human. This is where our story starts. Who were the earliest humans? Around 300,000 years ago, a new kind of primate appeared on the African continent. Scientists call this species Homo sapiens, wise man. But early Homo sapiens did not look, think, or live the way we do now. Their days were shaped entirely by the land around them, by weather, by animals, by the search for water. There were no cities, no writing, no permanent homes. Just small, mobile groups, moving with the seasons, carrying only what they could hold. For most of human history, and this is worth sitting with, this was simply what life was. Not a primitive stage on the way to something better. Just life lived close to the earth for thousands and thousands of generations. Hunter-gatherer life. Early humans lived in small bands, usually family groups, rarely more than a few dozen people. Their days revolved around two tasks: finding food and staying safe. Hunting large animals. Gathering plants, roots, fruit, and insects. Building simple shelters. Making fire. Teaching children how to survive. There was little time and little need for anything beyond this. The body's needs came first. Hunger, rest, warmth, safety from predators. Life was, in a very real sense, immediate. The present moment was everything. Survival as the only priority. For a very long stretch of early human history, evidence suggests daily life left little room for anything beyond the essentials of staying alive. There is no strong evidence, from this earliest period, of burial rituals. No jewelry, no art, no symbols carved into stone. Just tools, just survival. This matters because it tells us something important. The human mind, even in a body much like our own, does not automatically produce religion, ritual, or belief. Something had to change first. The evolution of intelligence. Over tens of thousands of years, the human brain, and the way it processed information, began to shift. Toolmaking became more advanced. Cooperation within groups became more complex. Communication deepened. Researchers who study this period point to a slow, gradual growth in what scientists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple ideas at once, to plan for a future that hasn't happened yet, to imagine something that isn't physically in front of you. This last part is key. Because before a person can believe in a spirit, an ancestor, or an unseen force, They first need the mental capacity to imagine something they cannot see. The development of imagination. Imagination is easy to take for granted, but it is, in evolutionary terms, extraordinary. It means holding a picture in your mind of something that isn't there. A place you've never been. A person who has died. A danger that hasn't happened yet. Some researchers believe this capacity, the ability to mentally represent things beyond direct experience, was the quiet turning point that made every later development possible: language, storytelling, and eventually, belief itself. Without imagination, there is no myth. Without myth, there is no religion. So in a very real sense, before there were gods, there had to be imagination first. Why humans became different from other animals? Many animals are intelligent. Many use tools. Many live in social groups. But as far as researchers can tell, no other species developed the same combination of traits early humans slowly acquired: complex symbolic thought, flexible language, and the ability to imagine things that do not exist in the physical world. This combination didn't appear overnight. It built up slowly, across enormous stretches of time, shaped by environment, cooperation, and the simple pressure to survive. And it set the stage, quietly, gradually, for something new to emerge. At what point did humans begin thinking beyond survival? There is no single moment we can point to. No date. No discovery. Only a slow unfolding of memory, of imagination, of minds beginning to wonder about things they could not see or touch. In the last part of our journey, we saw a mind slowly awakening, learning to imagine, to plan, to picture things beyond what the eye could see. Now, for the first time, we find physical evidence of that awakening. Not carved into stone. Not painted on a wall. Buried in the earth itself. The first intentional burials. Somewhere between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago, something new begins to appear in the archaeological record. Bodies that were not simply left behind, but deliberately placed in the ground. This is one of the most debated and most important questions in the study of early humans. How do researchers tell the difference between a body that ended up buried by chance, covered slowly by wind-blown sand or sediment, and a body that was placed there on purpose? The clues researchers look for include a shallow pit dug into the ground, a body arranged in a deliberate position, curled on its side, for example, and, in some cases, objects placed alongside the body that serve no practical survival purpose. When these signs appear together, many researchers see them as some of the earliest evidence of intentional burial. Graves with flowers and tools. One of the most famous and most debated examples comes from Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq, where Neanderthal remains were found alongside clusters of pollen. For decades, this was popularly described as a flower burial, the idea that Neanderthals gathered wildflowers and placed them with their dead. It's important to be honest about where the science actually stands. Many researchers now believe the pollen may have been introduced by burrowing animals, or blown in naturally, rather than placed there deliberately. The flower burial idea remains a popular and evocative image, but it is not settled fact. What is less disputed is that, at various sites, early humans were sometimes buried with tools, stone objects, or other items, though even here, researchers debate whether this reflects symbolic or spiritual meaning, or something more practical that we don't yet fully understand. Respect for the dead. Whatever the exact motivations, the presence of deliberate burial, at some sites, by some groups, during this period, tells us something significant. Early humans were beginning to treat death differently than other animals do. A body was no longer simply left where it fell. It was moved, positioned, sometimes accompanied by objects. This doesn't necessarily prove belief in an afterlife, but it does suggest something was changing in how humans related to death, memory, and the people they lost. Did humans believe in an afterlife? This is a question we cannot answer with certainty, and it's important to say that clearly. Burial alone does not prove a belief in life after death. Bodies may have been buried for practical reasons, to protect them from scavengers, to prevent the spread of disease, or simply out of an emotional response to loss, without any belief in a spiritual continuation. What we can say is that deliberate burial marks a shift in behavior, a new way of relating to the dead. Whether that behavior was accompanied by belief in an afterlife, we may never know for certain. Neanderthal burials. Neanderthals, a closely related human species that lived alongside and eventually alongside early Homo sapiens, are at the center of much of this debate. Sites across Europe and the Middle East have produced Neanderthal remains that some researchers interpret as deliberate burials, dating back roughly 40 to 100,000 years or more. This remains one of the more contested areas of paleoanthropology. Some researchers argue the evidence for intentional, symbolic Neanderthal burial is strong. Others argue that many of these cases can be explained by natural processes and caution against assuming Neanderthals held complex spiritual beliefs. The honest answer, at this point in the story, is we don't fully know. But the possibility that another human species may have treated its dead with similar care to our own is one of the more thought-provoking open questions in this field. Homo sapiens rituals. As Homo sapiens spread and populations grew, evidence of deliberate burial becomes more consistent and, in later periods, more elaborate, bodies arranged in specific positions, accompanied by ochre pigment, shell beads, or tools. These later examples, closer to 40,000 years ago, are generally considered less ambiguous by researchers than the earlier and more contested cases. Something was clearly forming, a relationship between the living and the dead that went beyond simple disposal of a body. Death, memory, ancestors. Three ideas begin to take shape in this period, ideas that will echo through nearly every religious tradition that follows. Death, no longer just an end, but an event marked, noticed, treated with care. Memory, the dead are not simply forgotten. Something about them is preserved, represented, held onto. Ancestors, the earliest thread of an idea that would grow, over tens of thousands of years, into something much larger, that those who came before us remain connected to those who come after. We cannot say, with certainty, what early humans believed happened after death. But we can say this: somewhere in this long stretch of time, humans began to treat death as meaningful, not just a biological event, but something worth marking, remembering, honoring. That single shift, from simply surviving death to giving it meaning, may be the true beginning of the spiritual mind. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore what may have driven this shift even further, fear of the unexplainable, and the invisible forces early humans believed might be responsible. By now, early humans had begun to imagine things beyond what they could see. They had begun to mark death as something meaningful. But imagination alone doesn't create belief. Something else was needed. Something that pushed the mind to search for answers it didn't have. That something was fear. A world without explanations. Try, for a moment, to imagine the world as an early human experienced it, without science, without written knowledge passed down across generations, without any way to ask why. Thunder rolled across the sky with no warning. Lightning split trees in half. Fire could warm a camp or destroy it completely. The ground itself, on rare occasions, would shake beneath their feet. People fell ill for reasons no one could see. Some recovered. Some did not. Dreams brought visions of people who were far away, or people who had died. Occasionally, the sun itself seemed to vanish in the middle of the day. And of course, birth and death, the two events every human life is framed by, remained, and in many ways still remain, profoundly mysterious. Thunder, lightning, and fire. For early humans, these were not abstract weather patterns. They were sudden, powerful, and unpredictable events with no visible cause. Something struck the tree. Something lit the sky. Something took the shelter away in a single night. When there is no explanation for how something happens, the mind often turns to a different question. Not how, but who. Earthquakes, disease, and dreams. The ground was supposed to be still. When it wasn't, that stillness, something so basic it was never even questioned, suddenly felt uncertain. Disease was, if anything, even harder to make sense of. A person could be strong one day and gone within a week, with no visible wound, no visible cause. And dreams added another layer of confusion entirely. In a dream, a person who had died could appear again, walking, speaking, present. What did that mean? Where had they gone, if they could still be seen? Eclipses, birth, and death. An eclipse, the sun disappearing, however briefly, in the middle of the day, would have been one of the most unsettling events a person could witness, with absolutely no framework for understanding what was happening. Birth was its own quiet mystery, new life, appearing from nothing anyone could fully explain. And death remained what it had always been, final and unexplained. Across nearly every one of these experiences, one thing was constant. Early humans lacked the tools to explain how these things happened. And the human mind, then as now, does not sit comfortably with unexplained events. How the brain searched for patterns. The human brain is, at its core, a pattern recognition machine. It looks for cause and effect. It looks for connections between events, even faint ones. This tendency likely helped early humans survive, noticing that a rustle in the grass often meant a predator was near, for example, could save a life. But this same pattern-seeking instinct doesn't switch off when there's no clear cause to find. Faced with thunder, disease, or a sudden death, the mind still searches for a reason, even when no visible reason exists. Hyperactive agency detection. Some researchers in cognitive science and the psychology of religion have proposed an idea to help explain this pattern-seeking tendency. The hypothesis that the human brain evolved to assume agency, the presence of a living, intentional someone behind uncertain or ambiguous events. This idea is often called hyperactive agency detection, or HADD. Researchers such as Justin Barrett and Stuart Guthrie have argued that, from an evolutionary standpoint, it was safer to mistakenly assume a predator was hiding in the grass than to miss a real threat. In other words, better to guess someone caused the rustling leaves and be wrong, than to assume nothing and be wrong about that instead. It's worth being clear that this is one influential theory among several, not a fact confirmed beyond debate. Other researchers emphasize different explanations for the origins of supernatural belief, including the role of social bonding and group cohesion. Most likely, no single explanation accounts for the full picture on its own. But the agency detection idea offers one compelling thread. If the mind is primed to assume someone is behind unexplained events, then thunder is no longer just thunder. It becomes the action of something. Disease is no longer random. It becomes something caused. The foundation of supernatural belief. This shift, from asking how did this happen to asking who caused this to happen, may be one of the earliest seeds of supernatural thinking. Not gods yet. Not spirits with names or forms. Just presence. The sense that something unseen was behind the events no one could otherwise explain. Fear, on its own, doesn't create religion. But fear of the unexplainable, paired with a mind built to search for causes, and perhaps primed to assume agency behind the unknown, created fertile ground for something new to grow. If the fear of the unexplainable planted a seed, what grew from it was one of the oldest religious ideas we know of, an idea still practiced by living communities around the world today. It's called animism, and its core belief is simple and strangely beautiful. Everything around us might be alive. Everything has a spirit. Animism is not a single religion with one founder or one sacred text. It's better understood as a broad way of seeing the world, one found, in different forms, across cultures on nearly every continent, and still practiced today. At its center is a simple idea, that spirit, or a kind of living presence, is not limited to humans and animals. It may also exist in the natural world itself. Trees, rivers, mountains, wind, fire. In an animist worldview, none of these are simply objects. A mountain is not only rock. A river is not only water. Each may carry its own presence, its own will, its own relationship with the people who live alongside it. Trees, rivers, and mountains. Imagine living entirely within the rhythms of a forest, or beside a river that provides water, food, and the boundary of your daily life. Over generations, that landscape stops being simply a backdrop to human life. It becomes a presence, one that can be respected, thanked, or offended. A great tree might be treated as an elder. A river might be asked, quietly, for safe passage. A mountain might be considered too sacred to climb, not out of fear of the physical danger, but out of respect for what, or who, the mountain is believed to be. Animals, wind, and fire. Animals, in many animist traditions, are not simply resources to be hunted, but beings with their own spirit and their own form of consciousness, sometimes regarded as equal to humans, sometimes as messengers, sometimes as ancestors in another form. Wind might carry voices. Fire might hold a temperament of its own, generous when treated with care, dangerous when disrespected. None of this required a written theology. It grew, gradually, from lives lived in close, daily relationship with the natural world. Shamans. Within many animist traditions, certain individuals take on a distinct role, the shaman. A shaman is generally understood as someone believed to move between the human world and the spirit world, a mediator, healer, and guide. This role is not the same in every culture, and the word shaman itself originates from the Tungusic peoples of Siberia, later applied more broadly by anthropologists to describe similar roles found elsewhere. It's worth noting that many cultures have their own specific terms and traditions, which don't always map neatly onto this single word. Spirit journeys. In many traditions, the shaman is believed capable of entering an altered state of consciousness, often described as a journey, to communicate with spirits, seek guidance, or retrieve lost knowledge on behalf of the community. These journeys are often described across very different cultures using strikingly similar imagery: traveling along a path, crossing water, ascending through layers of a world unseen by ordinary waking perception. Whether these experiences are understood as literal travel to another realm, or as a profound altered state of consciousness with deep meaning to those who practice it, is a matter of belief, one this documentary does not attempt to settle. Healing rituals. In many animist traditions, illness is not understood only in physical terms. It may be seen as a disturbance, spiritual, relational, or emotional, requiring more than physical remedy. Healing rituals, historically and in many communities today, might involve chanting, the use of specific plants, symbolic objects, or the shaman entering a trance state to identify the cause of the illness and address it directly. Trance. Trance states, achieved through rhythmic drumming, chanting, dance, fasting, or other practices, appear across a striking range of animist traditions worldwide. Researchers who study these practices note that trance states can produce genuine, measurable changes in consciousness and perception. What differs significantly between cultures is how those experiences are interpreted, as travel to a spirit world, as communication with ancestors, or as another kind of profound encounter altogether. Cave ceremonies. Some of the oldest surviving evidence connected to these practices comes from deep within caves, spaces separated from daylight, silence broken only by water dripping or air moving through stone. Many researchers believe caves may have held ceremonial or ritual significance in various early cultures, in part because of this natural sense of separation from the everyday world. We'll explore this more closely in the next part of our journey, when we look at cave paintings directly. Examples from around the world. Animist traditions and practices, in many different forms, can be found across a wide range of cultures and regions. Australia. Aboriginal Australian traditions describe a deep, ongoing relationship between land, ancestral beings, and living communities, developed and maintained over tens of thousands of years. These are living traditions, not historical relics. Siberia. Indigenous Siberian peoples, including groups such as the Evenki, developed shamanic traditions closely tied to hunting, the forest, and the spirits believed to inhabit it, traditions from which the word shaman itself originates. Africa. Across the vast and diverse continent of Africa, many traditional belief systems, distinct from one another across different peoples and regions, include animist elements, ancestor spirits, nature spirits, and ritual specialists who mediate between worlds. The Amazon. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon rainforest have long held traditions involving plant knowledge, spirit communication, and shamanic healing, some of which continue to be practiced today. It's worth emphasizing, these are not single, uniform belief systems. Each region contains enormous internal diversity, many distinct peoples, languages, and specific traditions, only loosely gathered here under the broader term animism for the purposes of this overview. Animism may be one of humanity's oldest religious ideas, but it is not only a story from the past. It remains alive today, practiced and adapted by communities across the world, carrying forward a way of seeing the world that predates recorded history itself, the belief that we are not separate from nature, but held within it, surrounded, always, by presence. In the next part of our journey, we'll step into the dark, quiet spaces where some of this belief may have first been expressed in image and symbol, the painted caves of the ancient world. Deep beneath the hills of what is now France and Spain, in complete darkness, early humans carried fire into the earth and left behind images that have survived for tens of thousands of years. These are some of the oldest works of art ever discovered. And they raise a question researchers still debate today. Why paint in a place no one could easily see? Why paint caves? Many of the most famous painted caves were not living spaces. They were deep, difficult to access, and far from any natural light. Reaching some of these chambers would have required carrying fire through narrow passages, in total darkness, often for a considerable distance underground. This detail matters. If these images were simply decoration, painting them in places so difficult to reach, and so rarely seen, seems like an unusual choice. That difficulty is part of why many researchers believe these spaces held some kind of special, possibly ceremonial or spiritual significance, separate from the everyday spaces where people actually lived, hunted, and slept. But it's important to be honest here. We don't have written records from the people who created this art. Every explanation for why they painted these images is, to some degree, an informed interpretation rather than a certainty. Hunting magic. One long-standing interpretation, popular through much of the 20th century, is often called the hunting magic theory. The idea is this: by painting an animal, often shown wounded, or surrounded by markings some interpret as spears, early humans may have believed they could influence the outcome of a future hunt. Creating the image, in this view, was a kind of ritual act meant to bring success or safety. This theory remains widely known, but it is not the only explanation researchers consider today, and more recent scholarship has raised significant questions about it. Many painted animals show no signs of hunting at all. Some caves contain far more images of non-prey animals, or abstract symbols, than hunted species. And some researchers point out that the hunting magic idea may say more about 20th century assumptions than about the people who actually created this art. Ritual art. A broader, more widely supported view today is that this art served a ritual or ceremonial purpose, without necessarily being tied specifically to hunting success. Some researchers connect this art to the kinds of practices we explored in the last part of our journey: shamanic trance, spirit journeys, and ceremonies conducted in caves precisely because of their separation from ordinary, everyday life. Under this view, the caves themselves may have functioned as sacred spaces, places set apart, entered deliberately, for purposes connected to belief and ritual rather than daily survival. Spiritual symbols. Alongside animal figures, many painted caves also contain abstract marks, dots, grids, hand stencils, and geometric patterns that do not represent any physical object at all. Researchers still debate what these symbols meant. Some suggest they may relate to trance-state visual patterns, the kind of geometric shapes people sometimes report seeing during altered states of consciousness. Others propose they may have functioned as territorial markers, forms of counting, or symbolic communication we simply don't yet fully understand. What we can say with more confidence is this: these were not random markings. Many appear placed with clear intention, in specific locations, sometimes layered or repeated across generations. Lascaux Cave. Discovered in southwestern France in 1940, Lascaux contains an extraordinary collection of painted animals, horses, deer, aurochs, and other creatures, estimated to be roughly 17,000 years old. The scale and detail of the paintings at Lascaux, often referred to as one of the most significant sites of prehistoric art ever found, transformed how researchers understood the artistic and possibly spiritual capacities of early humans. Chauvet Cave. Chauvet Cave, also in France, contains paintings estimated to be even older, some dated to more than 30,000 years ago, making it among the oldest known figurative art in the world. Chauvet is notable for its detailed depictions of predators, lions, bears, and rhinoceroses, rendered with a level of technical skill that surprised many researchers when the cave was discovered in 1994, challenging earlier assumptions that artistic skill developed gradually and simply over time. Altamira Cave. Altamira, located in northern Spain, was among the first painted caves ever discovered in the late 19th century. Its ceiling of painted bison, created using natural contours of the rock to add dimension and form, is considered one of the finest examples of Paleolithic art known today. When Altamira was first discovered, many researchers doubted that early humans were capable of creating such sophisticated work, a skepticism that was only overturned once further painted caves, including Chauvet and Lascaux, were later found. We may never know, with full certainty, what these painted caves meant to the people who created them. We've followed the earliest threads of belief, from fear of the unexplainable, to spirits in nature, to sacred images left in darkness. Now we turn to something quieter, but perhaps just as powerful, the belief that the dead do not simply disappear, they remain connected to the living. This is the root of ancestor veneration, a practice still very much alive today, in cultures around the world. Why remembering ancestors became sacred. We saw, earlier in this journey, that early humans began treating death as something meaningful, worth marking, worth remembering. Over generations, that impulse to remember appears to have deepened into something more structured, the belief that ancestors continue to hold a kind of presence or influence in the lives of their descendants. This idea takes different forms across different cultures. In some traditions, ancestors are seen as spiritual guardians. In others, they are consulted for guidance, honored through offerings, or considered active participants in the life of the family and community, not simply figures from the past. Family identity. For many cultures, remembering ancestors is closely tied to a sense of belonging. Knowing where you come from, literally, the people who came before you, can shape a person's sense of identity and place within a family line. This isn't only a spiritual practice. It's also, in many traditions, a way of preserving history, values, and a sense of continuity across generations. Tribal identity. Beyond the immediate family, ancestor veneration has historically played a role in shaping the identity of larger groups, clans, tribes, and communities. Shared ancestry, whether understood literally or symbolically, has often served as a unifying thread, a way of answering the question, who are we and where do we come from, together? Lineage. Many cultures place significant importance on tracing lineage, the specific line of ancestors connecting a person to those who came before. In some traditions, this is preserved through oral history, passed down and recited across generations. In others, it's recorded through genealogies, family records, or ritual practices designed specifically to preserve this knowledge over time. Lineage, in these contexts, is often more than historical record-keeping. It can carry spiritual or social significance, a connection believed to shape identity, responsibility, and even protection. Protection from ancestors. In many ancestor-venerating traditions, ancestors are not simply remembered, they are believed to remain active, in some form, in the lives of their descendants. This can take many forms, ancestors offering guidance during difficult decisions, providing protection from harm, or being consulted through ritual during significant life events. It's worth being clear that beliefs about how ancestors remain present vary enormously between cultures, from spiritual guardianship to symbolic presence, to more literal beliefs about ongoing communication. This documentary does not claim to know which, if any, reflects objective reality, only that these beliefs have shaped human life and culture profoundly across a very long span of time. Ancestor veneration in ancient China. One of the most well-documented and long-standing traditions of ancestor veneration comes from ancient China, where it has played a role in religious and social life for thousands of years and continues in adapted forms today. Historically, ancestor veneration in China was closely connected to Confucian values of filial piety, respect and duty toward one's parents and, by extension, one's ancestral line. Rituals, offerings, and ancestral tablets placed in family shrines were common ways of maintaining a connection between living descendants and those who had passed. This practice was not separate from daily or civic life. It was, in many periods of Chinese history, deeply woven into family structure, governance, and broader religious and philosophical life. Ancestor veneration in Africa. Across the African continent, again, home to enormous cultural and religious diversity, not a single tradition, ancestor veneration appears in many different forms among many different peoples. In numerous traditions, ancestors are considered active intermediaries between the living and a wider spiritual world, consulted for guidance, honored during important events, and remembered as continuing members of the family even after death. As with earlier parts of our journey, it's important not to flatten this diversity into one single description. Practices, beliefs, and specific roles of ancestors differ significantly across the continent's many distinct cultures and people. Ancestor veneration in the Pacific Islands. Throughout many Pacific Island cultures, ancestors have historically held, and in many communities continue to hold, deep significance, often connected to genealogy, land rights, and community identity. In several Polynesian traditions, for example, genealogical knowledge tracing descent from specific ancestors, sometimes reaching back many generations, has carried significant social and spiritual importance, including in matters of leadership and land. Across vastly different cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, a similar thread appears again and again: the belief that death does not sever the bond between the living and those who came before them. Whether understood as spiritual presence, guidance, protection, or simply the enduring weight of memory, ancestor veneration reflects something deeply human: the refusal to let the people we love simply disappear. In the next part of our journey, human life itself is about to change in a fundamental way, as we explore the moment humans stopped wandering and began, for the first time, to settle and to farm. Nearly all of human history up to this point, our ancestors moved. They followed animals. They followed seasons. They followed water. But around 10,000 years ago, in several regions of the world, something began to change, something that would reshape not only how humans lived, but how they believed. Humans began to stay. The Neolithic Revolution. Historians and archaeologists refer to this shift as the Neolithic Revolution, the gradual transition from hunting and gathering to farming and settled life. This wasn't a single event, and it didn't happen everywhere at once. In different regions of the world, the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, parts of China, Mesoamerica, and others, different communities independently began cultivating plants and domesticating animals over a period spanning thousands of years. It's also worth noting that this transition wasn't always a smooth improvement in quality of life. Some evidence suggests early farming populations experienced new challenges, more physically demanding labor in some contexts, greater vulnerability to famine when crops failed, and increased exposure to disease as people began living closer together and closer to domesticated animals. Even so, farming spread. And with it, human life began to take on an entirely different shape. Humans settle. Where early humans once carried their entire world with them, tools, shelter, food, farming communities began building permanent homes, staying in one place across seasons and, eventually, across generations. This is a profound shift. A place was no longer simply passed through. It became home, tied to a specific plot of land, a specific water source, a specific stretch of sky. With permanence came new possibilities, storage of surplus food, population growth, and eventually, the earliest villages. But permanence also brought a new kind of vulnerability. A new dependence, rain, harvest, and seasons. For a hunter-gatherer, if one region failed to provide enough food, the group could move on. For a farming community, this was no longer simple. Their food supply was now tied to a single, fixed piece of land, and to forces entirely outside their control. Rain, arriving at the right time, in the right amount. The success or failure of a harvest. The turning of the seasons followed with increasing precision, since planting or harvesting at the wrong moment could mean the difference between abundance and hunger. This dependence was new, and it was total. A community's survival now rested on forces no one could predict or command, only observe and hope to understand. Religion becomes connected with nature. It's in this context that many researchers see a significant shift in religious belief. Where earlier spiritual ideas, animism, ancestor veneration, had already given shape to the unseen world, farming communities increasingly directed their attention toward the specific forces that governed agricultural survival. If a community's life now depended on rain arriving at the right time, it follows that rain itself might become something to petition, to honor, to seek favor from. This period sees the rise of deities and rituals connected directly to the agricultural cycle, a shift some researchers describe as religion becoming more structured around the specific, recurring needs of settled life. Gods of rain. Across numerous early agricultural societies, deities associated with rain and storms held significant importance, often among the most prominent figures in a community's belief system, given how directly rainfall determined survival. These figures took different forms in different cultures, but the underlying concern was often similar: a recognition that this single, unpredictable force of nature held enormous power over daily life. Gods of the sun. The sun, too, took on heightened significance in agricultural societies, tied closely to the rhythm of seasons, the length of days, and the growth of crops. In many early farming cultures, solar deities or solar-associated rituals became connected to the broader cycle of planting and harvest, marking key points in the agricultural calendar. Gods of fertility. Fertility of the land, of crops, and of livestock became a central religious concern for many early farming communities, given its direct connection to survival and continuity. Fertility deities and rituals appear across numerous early agricultural cultures in different forms, often connected to the broader idea of renewal, the yearly cycle of planting, growth, harvest, and the return of the next planting season. Gods of crops. Some cultures developed deities associated specifically with particular crops central to their survival. Grain, in many parts of the ancient Near East and Europe, for example, held enough significance to be closely tied to specific religious figures and seasonal festivals marking planting and harvest. These crop-specific traditions reflect just how directly religious belief, in this period, mirrored the practical rhythms of agricultural life. To farming changed nearly everything about how humans lived, where they stayed, how they organized their communities, and what they depended on to survive. And in doing so, it changed how they related to the unseen world as well. Belief, once shaped largely by fear of the unexplainable and reverence for ancestors, now began to organize itself around the specific, recurring rhythms of a settled, agricultural life. The sun, the rain, the harvest, the turning of the seasons. In the next part of our journey, we'll see where this new, settled way of life led to structures built with astonishing scale and ambition, built not after farming began, but, in at least one remarkable case, seemingly before it. In the last part of our journey, we saw how farming reshaped religion, tying belief to rain, harvest, and the turning of the seasons. But in the hills of southeastern Turkey, archaeologists uncovered something that seems, at first glance, to turn that story on its head. A massive complex of carved stone. Built, it seems, before farming had even begun. Before cities, there were temples. For much of the 20th century, the standard historical narrative was fairly linear. Humans settled down, developed farming, formed villages, grew into towns, and only then, once society had reached sufficient complexity, began constructing large-scale religious monuments. One remarkable site has challenged that narrative and forced researchers to reconsider the order in which some of these developments actually occurred. Göbekli Tepe. Located in what is now southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe is a monumental archaeological site dating back roughly 11,500 years, placing it before, or right at the very beginning of, the period when farming was first developing in the region. The site consists of large circular and oval structures, featuring massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, arranged in careful formation. Many of these pillars are carved with detailed reliefs, animals, abstract symbols, and in some cases, stylized human-like forms. Excavation of the site began in earnest in the 1990s, led by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, whose early interpretation proposed that Göbekli Tepe functioned primarily as a ceremonial or religious site, built, remarkably, by hunter-gatherer communities who had not yet developed farming or permanent settlement. An evolving understanding. It's important, in a documentary committed to accuracy, to be clear about where the science currently stands, because it has shifted since Göbekli Tepe was first excavated. Schmidt's original interpretation, that the site was purely ceremonial, a kind of dedicated temple with no evidence of everyday domestic life, captured enormous public attention and became widely popularized. More recent excavation and analysis, however, have complicated this picture. Later research has uncovered evidence some archaeologists interpret as signs of domestic activity at the site, tools associated with food processing, for example, suggesting the complex may have served a more mixed purpose, combining ceremonial function with aspects of daily settlement life, rather than being an exclusively sacred space entirely separate from the practical business of living. The full picture is still developing, and researchers continue to debate the balance between ceremonial and domestic use at the site. What remains widely agreed upon is this: Göbekli Tepe represents monumental, large-scale construction achieved by a society that had not yet developed full-scale agriculture, a genuinely significant finding, regardless of how the ceremonial versus domestic debate is ultimately resolved. Why build monuments before farming? This question sits at the heart of why Göbekli Tepe matters so much to our story. Constructing a site of this scale required enormous coordinated effort, quarrying massive stone pillars, transporting them, carving detailed reliefs, and organizing the labor of many people over an extended period, all achieved, it appears, without the food surpluses that farming typically provides to support such large-scale, non-food-producing labor. This raises a genuinely open question that researchers continue to explore: what motivated hunter-gatherer communities, who were still moving seasonally and lacked large stored surpluses, to invest this level of coordinated effort into construction on this scale? Did religion create civilization? Klaus Schmidt himself proposed a striking hypothesis, that shared religious or ceremonial purpose, the desire to gather, build, and worship together, may have been a driving force that helped bring people together in larger numbers, potentially even contributing to the development of settled life and eventually agriculture itself. In other words, rather than religion emerging after civilization as a product of settled complexity, this hypothesis suggests belief and shared ritual practice may have played a role in creating the very conditions that led to civilization in the first place. This remains a hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. It's a compelling and influential idea within archaeology, but like much of what we've covered in this journey, it continues to be debated, tested, and refined as more evidence comes to light, including the evolving understanding of Göbekli Tepe itself. Whatever the final answer, Göbekli Tepe reminds us of something important. The story of religion's origins is not a simple, straight line. Our understanding continues to change as new evidence is uncovered, and the order we once assumed, of farming first, belief later, may not hold as neatly as once thought. At this point in our journey, belief had largely taken formless shapes: spirits in nature, presence behind the unexplainable, forces tied to rain and harvest. But as settled communities grew larger, and as language and storytelling grew more elaborate, something new began to happen. The unseen forces people had long sensed around them began, gradually, to take on faces. Names, personalities, stories of their own. The development of mythology. Mythology, the structured, narrative telling of stories involving gods, spirits, and supernatural events, appears to develop gradually alongside settled civilization, though its roots likely stretch back much further, into oral traditions that predate writing entirely. As communities grew larger and more complex, the loose, formless spiritual ideas of earlier periods seem to have become more structured, organized into specific figures, with specific roles, relationships, and stories that could be told, remembered, and passed down across generations. This shift mattered. A named god, with a personality and a story, is easier to relate to, easier to petition, easier to teach to children, easier to unite a community around, than a vague, formless sense of presence in the wind or the rain. Gods gain names. One of the clearest markers of this shift is the appearance of specific, individual names for deities, figures who could be called upon, referred to, and distinguished from one another. Naming is a significant cognitive and cultural step. It transforms a general concept, the spirit of the storm, into a specific individual, a being with a defined identity, referred to consistently across a community and across generations. Gods gain families. Alongside names, many mythologies developed elaborate relationships between deities, gods and goddesses connected as parents, children, siblings, and rivals, forming extended divine families. These divine family structures often mirrored, in some ways, the human families and social structures of the cultures that created them, reflecting, and sometimes explaining or justifying, the social order of the people who told these stories. Gods gain personalities. Where earlier spiritual forces were often described in terms of what they did, bringing rain, causing storms, the gods of developing mythologies increasingly took on distinct personalities, traits, temperaments, and emotional complexity. Some deities were characterized as wise, others as jealous, generous, vengeful, or protective. This added dimension made these figures far more vivid within a community's storytelling tradition, no longer only forces of nature, but characters with motivations of their own. Gods gain stories. Perhaps most significantly, these deities became central figures in narrative, stories explaining the origins of the world, the reasons behind natural events, the relationships between gods and humans, and the moral or social lessons a community wished to pass down. These stories served multiple purposes at once, explaining the unexplainable, reinforcing social values, entertaining, and connecting a community around a shared cultural memory. Storm gods. Given how central weather remained to agricultural survival, storm deities, associated with thunder, lightning, and rain, held prominent places in many early mythologies across different, unrelated cultures. The recurring importance of storm-associated deities across so many separate traditions reflects just how central this single, unpredictable force of nature remained to human survival, long after the earliest fears we explored at the beginning of our journey. Sun gods. Solar deities appear with similar consistency across many early civilizations, often associated with life, order, kingship, or the passage of time, reflecting the sun's role as one of the most visible, reliable markers of daily and seasonal rhythm. Moon gods. Lunar deities, too, appear widely, often connected to timekeeping, given the moon's regular cycle, as well as to night, mystery, or in some traditions, fertility and change. Interestingly, whether the moon was represented as male or female varied significantly across different cultures, a reminder that these mythological structures, while sharing broad patterns, were shaped by the specific beliefs and social structures of each individual culture. Earth goddesses. Many early mythologies also developed deities associated with the earth itself, often connected to fertility, growth, and the sustaining of life, reflecting agriculture's central role in these societies. Earth-associated deities frequently appear as maternal or nurturing figures across many traditions, though again, the specific characteristics and roles of these figures varied considerably between cultures. Earth of mythology. Taken together, This period marks what many researchers consider the true birth of mythology as a structured cultural institution, no longer isolated spiritual impressions, but interconnected systems of belief, narrative, and meaning, maintained and passed down across entire civilizations. This foundation would go on to shape nearly everything that followed: the formal religions of the ancient world, the moral and philosophical traditions that emerged from them, and, in many ways, the stories human cultures continue to tell today. Belief had traveled a long distance by this point in our journey, from formless fear of the unexplainable, to spirits in nature, to ancestors remembered, to gods now known by name. In the next part of our journey, we'll see how these developing belief systems became deeply woven into the very structure of the earliest civilizations, shaping not only how people worshipped, but how they were governed. Now, belief had taken shape: gods with names, families, and stories, worshipped by growing communities across the ancient world. But as villages grew into cities, and cities into full civilizations, religion did not simply continue alongside society. It became woven into its very structure, shaping government, law, and daily life in ways that are difficult to overstate. Mesopotamia. In the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq, some of the world's earliest cities emerged, among them Uruk, Ur, and Babylon. Mesopotamian religion involved a large pantheon of gods, each generally associated with a specific city, function, or force of nature. Temples were not simply places of worship. They often functioned as major economic centers, managing land, labor, and stored grain on behalf of the community. Kingship in Mesopotamia was frequently framed in religious terms, with rulers described as chosen by, or acting on behalf of, the gods, a framing that gave political authority a sacred dimension. Ancient Egypt. Along the Nile River, ancient Egyptian civilization developed one of the most elaborate religious systems of the ancient world, closely tied to kingship, the afterlife, and the natural cycles of the river itself. The pharaoh held a uniquely sacred role within Egyptian religion, generally understood as a divine or semi-divine figure, connecting the human and divine worlds and responsible for maintaining Ma'at, a central Egyptian concept referring to cosmic order, balance, and truth. Egyptian religious belief placed enormous emphasis on the afterlife, reflected in elaborate burial practices, the construction of monumental tombs, and religious texts intended to guide the deceased through the journey beyond death. The Indus Valley. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished across parts of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, presents a different kind of challenge for researchers. Much of its religious life remains genuinely uncertain, since its writing system has not yet been definitively deciphered. Archaeological evidence, including seals depicting figures in what some researchers interpret as ritual poses, and structures some believe may have served ceremonial or bathing purposes, suggests organized religious practice existed. However, without a fully understood written language, much of what we might say about specific Indus Valley beliefs remains informed speculation rather than established fact. This is an important reminder, in a documentary committed to accuracy. Not every ancient civilization has left us a clear picture of its religious life, and it's important to say so plainly rather than filling the gap with confident guesses. Ancient China. In ancient China, religious belief developed alongside, and deeply intertwined with, political authority, particularly through the concept of the mandate of heaven, which emerged during the Zhou dynasty. Under this concept, a ruler's legitimacy was understood as granted by a divine or heavenly authority, contingent on just and capable rule. Natural disasters, famine, or widespread unrest could be interpreted as signs that a ruler had lost this mandate, providing, notably, a religious framework that could also justify the removal of a ruler, not only their authority. Ancestor veneration, which we explored earlier in our journey, also remained deeply significant throughout Chinese religious and political life during this period, connecting family, governance, and belief closely together. Priests. Across these civilizations, specialized religious figures, priests, took on increasingly formal, structured roles, conducting rituals, maintaining temples, interpreting omens, and often overseeing significant economic and administrative responsibilities as well. In many early civilizations, priesthoods represented some of the earliest examples of specialized, non-agricultural professions, made possible by the food surpluses that settled farming communities were now able to produce. Kings. Kingship, across nearly all of these civilizations, was closely bound to religious belief. Rulers were frequently described as chosen by the gods, descended from divine figures, or personally responsible for maintaining right relationship between their people and the divine world. This connection between religious and political authority served an important function. It provided a framework for legitimizing power, uniting large populations under a shared belief system, and, in some cases, holding rulers accountable to standards understood as divinely sanctioned. Temples. Temples, across these civilizations, were rarely just houses of worship. They often functioned as major centers of economic activity, storing grain, managing land and labor, and in some cases functioning as the largest and most complex institutions within an entire city or region. This dual role, sacred and economic, meant that religious institutions held significant, tangible power within these early societies, well beyond the spiritual sphere alone. The development of writing itself is closely tied to religious and administrative record-keeping in several of these civilizations. Early Mesopotamian cuneiform, for example, developed largely to track economic transactions, including temple holdings and offerings, meaning some of humanity's earliest written records are directly connected to religious administration. Writing also allowed religious stories, rituals, and laws to be preserved with far greater consistency and detail than oral tradition alone could provide, fundamentally changing how belief systems could be recorded, standardized, and passed down. Religious laws. Several of these civilizations developed legal codes closely tied to religious authority. Law understood not simply as human convention, but as reflecting a divinely sanctioned order. One of the most well-known examples is the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, dating to roughly the 18th century BCE, which presents its laws as handed down with the sanction of the god Shamash, framing justice itself as a matter of divine, not merely human, authority. This blending of religious and legal authority appears, in different forms, across many of these early civilizations, reinforcing the deep connection between belief, governance, and the maintenance of social order in the ancient world. In this period, religion moved far beyond personal or communal belief. It became structural, embedded in government, law, economy, and the everyday functioning of entire civilizations. Kings ruled by divine sanction. Temples managed wealth. Priesthoods held real power. And written language itself, in several cases, developed hand in hand with religious and administrative life. The ancient world, In civilizations separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of miles, with little or no contact between them, remarkably similar mythological ideas began to appear. Different gods, different names, different landscapes, but strikingly similar questions, and, in many cases, strikingly similar answers. Egyptian mythology. We touched on Egyptian religion in the last part of our journey, its close connection to kingship, the afterlife, and the concept of cosmic order known as Ma'at. Egyptian mythology also developed a rich set of creation stories, varying somewhat between different religious centers, generally describing the world emerging from a primordial ocean of chaos, often associated with the god Nun, before creation began. Greek mythology. Greek mythology developed an extensive, richly interconnected system of gods, goddesses, heroes, and legendary events, centered around Mount Olympus and figures such as Zeus, Athena, and Poseidon, though the tradition included many hundreds of deities and mythological figures altogether. Greek mythology placed particular emphasis on heroic narrative, figures such as Heracles or Odysseus, whose stories combine divine involvement with distinctly human struggle, flaw, and consequence. Norse mythology. Norse mythology, developed among the peoples of Scandinavia, centered on gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freyja, and described a cosmos of 9 interconnected realms, bound together by the great world tree, Yggdrasil. Norse mythology is particularly notable for its vision of an eventual cosmic end, Ragnarok, a foretold battle and world-ending event, after which, in most versions of the myth, the world was expected to be renewed. Celtic mythology. Celtic mythology, developed among the Celtic peoples of Iron Age Europe and preserved in later written form primarily through Irish and Welsh traditions, described a richly populated world of gods, heroes, and the otherworld, a realm existing alongside, and sometimes overlapping with, the human world. Because much of Celtic mythology was originally oral, and was recorded in writing only centuries later, often by Christian scribes, researchers approach these sources with some caution regarding how faithfully they preserve earlier, pre-Christian belief. African traditional religions. As we've noted throughout this journey, Africa encompasses an extraordinary diversity of distinct peoples, languages, and belief systems, far too vast to summarize as a single mythology. Broadly, however, many traditional African religious systems share certain recurring elements: a supreme or creator deity, often considered somewhat distant from daily affairs, a range of lesser deities or spirits more directly involved in daily life, and ancestor veneration, which we explored earlier in our journey, playing a significant ongoing role. Specific traditions, such as Yoruba religion in West Africa, with its pantheon of Orishas, or various Bantu-speaking peoples' beliefs across Central and Southern Africa, offer well-documented examples, though each represents just one thread among many distinct traditions across the continent. Native American beliefs. Similarly, Native American beliefs refers not to one tradition, but to an enormous range of distinct belief systems among hundreds of different indigenous peoples across North America, each with its own specific cosmology, stories, and practices. That said, certain broad patterns appear across many, though not all, of these traditions: a close spiritual relationship with the natural world and animals, creation narratives often involving specific sacred landscapes, and belief systems deeply integrated with daily life, community structure, and the land itself. It's worth emphasizing again, These are living traditions, still practiced and maintained today by indigenous communities, not solely historical artifacts. Aboriginal Dreamtime. Aboriginal Australian traditions describe what is often translated into English as dreamtime or the dreaming, a concept referring to the foundational period in which ancestral beings shaped the land, established law, and set the order of the world. It's important to approach this concept carefully and respectfully. Dreamtime is not simply a mythological story from the past. It's generally understood within Aboriginal traditions as an ongoing spiritual reality connected to law, land, and identity in the present, not only to ancient origins. Aboriginal cultures also maintain enormous internal diversity, with hundreds of distinct language groups, each holding their own specific traditions and knowledge, much of which is not intended for outside audiences to know or share in detail. For that reason, this documentary presents only this general, publicly discussed overview, out of respect for knowledge that many Aboriginal communities consider sacred and restricted. Common themes: creation. Across nearly all of these traditions, creation narratives attempt to answer some version of the same fundamental question: how did the world, and the people in it, come to exist? The specific answers vary enormously: a primordial ocean, a cosmic egg, ancestral beings shaping the land. But the underlying question appears to be close to universal. Common themes: floods. Flood narratives appear across a striking number of unrelated mythological traditions worldwide, from Mesopotamia to Greece to indigenous traditions in the Americas. Researchers offer various explanations for this recurring pattern, including the possibility that many early human settlements were located near rivers or coastlines, where large floods would have been a genuinely recurring and memorable natural event, independently inspiring similar stories in unconnected cultures. Common themes: afterlife. Belief in some form of continuation after death, whether as spirit, soul, or some other form of existence, appears across nearly every mythological tradition explored in this documentary, though the specific nature of that afterlife varies enormously between cultures. Common themes: heroes. Hero narratives, figures who undertake difficult journeys, face great challenges, and often mediate between the human and divine worlds, appear across an extraordinary range of unrelated mythological traditions, suggesting this narrative structure may reflect something deeply resonant about how humans understand struggle, growth, and meaning. Common themes: cosmic order. Finally, many traditions include some concept of cosmic order, a balance or structure to the universe that can be disrupted or maintained, often connected to human behavior, ritual, or moral conduct. We saw this directly in Egyptian Ma'at, and in different forms, in similar concepts across other traditions covered in this documentary. What are we to make of these recurring patterns: creation, flood, afterlife, heroism, cosmic order, appearing again and again across cultures that had no contact with one another at all? Researchers offer different explanations: shared aspects of human psychology, shared environmental experiences, or simply the natural result of different minds facing the same fundamental mysteries of existence, and arriving at strikingly similar kinds of answers. Whatever the explanation, these shared threads suggest something worth sitting with quietly: that despite our differences, human beings across time and place may be united by the same deep questions. In the next part of our journey, those questions begin to take a new shape, as we enter an age when great thinkers, across several civilizations, began to ask not which gods exist, but something quieter, and perhaps even more challenging: How should we live? Thousands of years, across the civilizations we've explored, religious belief had largely centered on a similar kind of question: which gods exist, and what do they require of us? But somewhere between roughly 800 and 200 BCE, in several separate regions of the world, with little direct contact between them, something remarkable began to happen. Great thinkers, in different civilizations, began to ask a different kind of question entirely. The Axial Age. Historians and philosophers sometimes refer to this period as the Axial Age, a term introduced by the German philosopher Karl Jaspers in the mid-20th century to describe this apparent, roughly simultaneous shift in thought across several unconnected civilizations. It's worth noting that the Axial Age is a framework proposed after the fact, a way of grouping and interpreting historical developments, not a label the thinkers of this period used themselves, and one that some historians debate in terms of how precisely simultaneous or connected these developments truly were. Still, taken broadly, this period does appear to mark a genuine shift in several major traditions, from a focus on ritual, deity, and cosmic order, toward deeper questions of ethics, inner life, and how a person ought to live. Siddhartha Gautama. In the region of present-day Nepal and northern India, sometime around the 5th or 6th century BC, the exact dates remain debated among historians. A man named Siddhartha Gautama began teaching a path focused on understanding and ending human suffering. Gautama, who became known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One, taught what became known as the Four Noble Truths, a framework centered on the nature of suffering, its causes, and a path toward its cessation, along with the Eightfold Path, a set of ethical and mental disciplines intended to guide practitioners toward that goal. Buddhism's early teachings placed relatively less emphasis on gods or divine worship, and considerably more emphasis on direct insight, ethical conduct, and the nature of the mind itself, a notable shift from many of the belief systems we've explored earlier in this journey. Confucius. In China, during a period of significant political instability sometimes called the Spring and Autumn period, a thinker named Confucius, born around 551 BCE, developed a philosophy centered on ethics, social harmony, and proper relationships between individuals, families, and the state. Confucius placed enormous emphasis on virtues such as filial piety, which we touched on earlier in connection with Chinese ancestor veneration, along with benevolence, propriety, and righteous conduct. His teachings, later compiled by students in a text known as the Analects, focused less on metaphysical or divine questions and more on practical, ethical guidance for living well within a community. Laozi. Also within the Chinese tradition, though the historical details here are genuinely uncertain, and some scholars question whether Laozi was a single historical figure at all, the Tao Te Ching is traditionally attributed to a sage named Laozi, presenting a philosophy centered on the Tao, often translated as the Way, a natural order underlying the universe. Taoist philosophy, as expressed in this text, emphasized simplicity, harmony with nature, and a principle sometimes translated as effortless action, a way of living aligned with the natural flow of things, rather than forced against it. The Hebrew prophets. Within ancient Israelite tradition, a series of figures known as the prophets, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others, writing across several centuries broadly within this period, developed a body of teaching that placed strong emphasis on ethical conduct, social justice, and faithfulness to God, often specifically criticizing corruption, injustice, and the mistreatment of the poor and vulnerable within their society. This prophetic tradition is notable for the way it directly linked religious faithfulness to ethical and social responsibility, framing how a person or society treated the vulnerable as a matter of direct religious significance, not a separate concern from worship itself. Early Greek philosophers. In ancient Greece, during roughly this same broad period, thinkers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, spanning from the 5th into the 4th century BC, began developing systematic philosophical inquiry into ethics, truth, knowledge, and the nature of a good life. Socrates, as presented through the writings of his student Plato, was known for a method of persistent questioning aimed at examining commonly held beliefs and assumptions, a method that placed inquiry and reasoned dialogue at the center of the search for truth, rather than religious authority or tradition alone. How should we live? Across each of these separate traditions, a strikingly similar question begins to take center stage. Not simply what rituals should be performed or which gods should be honored, but how a person ought to live, what constitutes a good, ethical, meaningful life. Truth. Related to this, several of these traditions turned serious, sustained attention toward questions of truth and knowledge, how we come to know anything with confidence, and what separates genuine understanding from mere assumption or tradition. What is suffering? Suffering, in particular, became a central concern, most explicitly within Buddhist thought, but echoed, in different forms, across several of these traditions. Why do humans suffer, and is there a path toward reducing or transcending it? What is justice? Finally, questions of justice, how individuals and societies ought to treat one another, particularly the vulnerable, appear prominently across several of these traditions, from the Hebrew prophets' emphasis on social justice, to Confucian ideas of righteous governance, to Greek philosophical inquiry into the nature of a just society. Something significant shifted during this period. Across civilizations with no meaningful contact with one another, human thought turned inward, toward ethics, toward suffering, toward the search for a life well lived, in ways that would go on to shape nearly every major religious and philosophical tradition that followed. In the next part of our journey, we'll trace how several of the world's major religious traditions, including some rooted directly in this period, took shape, spread, and endured across the centuries that followed. On approach, this section presents each tradition in its historical and social context, when, where, and under what conditions it emerged, without comparing or evaluating truth claims between traditions. Each is described respectfully, on its own terms. We've followed belief across an enormous span of time, from fear of thunder, to spirits in rivers and trees, to gods with names and stories, to philosophers asking how we ought to live. Now, in this part of our journey, we arrive at traditions that continue in living form today, practiced, in some cases, by billions of people around the world. We'll move through each in turn, simply and historically, not to compare them, but to understand where and how each one began. Hinduism. Hinduism is, in some ways, unlike many of the traditions we'll cover in this part of our journey, in that it has no single founder, no single founding moment, and no single original text. It developed gradually, over an enormous span of time, from a range of religious, cultural, and philosophical traditions on the Indian subcontinent. Its earliest roots are often traced to the Vedic period, beginning roughly 3,500 years ago, associated with a body of sacred texts called the Vedas, among the oldest surviving religious texts in the world. Over the following centuries, Hindu belief and practice continued to develop, incorporating philosophical traditions recorded in texts such as the Upanishads, along with enormous regional and cultural diversity across the subcontinent. Because of this long-layered development, many scholars describe Hinduism less as a single unified religion and more as a broad family of related traditions, sharing certain common threads, including concepts such as dharma, karma, and reincarnation, while allowing for significant diversity in belief and practice among its adherents. Judaism. Judaism traces its origins to the ancient Israelites, with tradition holding that its roots begin with the patriarch Abraham, and with a foundational covenant later described as established between God and the Israelite people. Historically, Judaism's development is closely tied to the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the construction and eventual destruction of the First Temple in Jerusalem, and a pivotal period of exile in Babylon during the 6th century BCE, a period that many historians view as significant in shaping Jewish religious identity and practice, including the increased importance of the Torah as a portable, central text of faith and law. Central to Jewish tradition is the belief in one God, and a covenantal relationship between that God and the Jewish people, along with an emphasis on Torah study, ethical conduct, and religious law, or halakha, which continues to shape Jewish religious life today. Buddhism. We touched on the origins of Buddhism in the last part of our journey, with the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama in the region of present-day Nepal and northern India, sometime around the 5th or 6th century BCE. Following Gautama's death, his teachings were preserved and transmitted by a growing community of monastic followers, known as the Sangha. Buddhism spread significantly beyond its region of origin in the centuries that followed, particularly under the patronage of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, whose support helped establish Buddhism as a major religious tradition across South and eventually East and Southeast Asia. Over time, Buddhism developed into several major branches, including Theravada, prominent in Southeast Asia, and Mahayana, prominent across East Asia, each maintaining core teachings while developing distinct practices, texts, and interpretations. Jainism developed in the same broad region and general time period as early Buddhism, on the Indian subcontinent, and is closely associated with Mahavira, traditionally regarded as the 24th in a line of enlightened teachers known as Tirthankaras. Jain tradition holds that Mahavira lived during roughly the same period as Siddhartha Gautama, and Jain teaching places central emphasis on the principle of ahimsa, non-violence toward all living beings, along with asceticism, truthfulness, and non-attachment as central paths towards spiritual liberation. Jainism has remained a significant, continuously practiced religious tradition on the Indian subcontinent for well over 2,000 years, notable in particular for the depth and rigor of its commitment to non-violence in daily practice. Christianity. Christianity traces its origins to the life and teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, understood by historians to have lived in the region of Roman Judea, in the eastern Mediterranean, during the early 1st century CE. Historical sources describing Jesus' life come primarily from the 4 Gospels of the New Testament, along with limited references in other historical sources of the period. Christian tradition holds that Jesus was crucified by Roman authorities and, central to Christian faith, that he rose from the dead, an event of core theological significance to Christian belief, and one this documentary presents as a matter of religious tradition and faith, not as a claim of historical fact to be verified or denied. Following Jesus' death, his early followers, including figures such as Paul of Tarsus, played a significant role in spreading these teachings across the Roman Empire over the following centuries. Christianity's status shifted dramatically in the 4th century CE, when it gained official toleration and, eventually, imperial favor within the Roman Empire, developments that contributed significantly to its widespread growth across Europe and, in the centuries that followed, around the world. Islam. Islam traces its origins to the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, born in Mecca, in the Arabian Peninsula, in the late 6th century CE. Islamic tradition holds that, beginning around 610 CE, Muhammad received a series of revelations, later compiled into the Quran, Islam's central sacred text. Facing opposition in Mecca, Muhammad and his early followers migrated to the city of Medina in 622 CE, an event known as the Hijra, which marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In the years that followed, Islam spread rapidly across the Arabian Peninsula and, within just a few decades after Muhammad's death in 632 CE, across a vast region spanning the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond, one of the more rapid religious and political expansions in recorded history. Central to Islamic belief is monotheism, submission to the one God, Allah, along with the 5 pillars of Islam, a framework of core religious practices observed by Muslims worldwide. Sikhism. Sikhism is among the more recent of the traditions covered in this part of our journey, founded by Guru Nanak in the Punjab region of South Asia in the late 15th century CE. Guru Nanak's teachings emphasized the oneness of God, equality among all people regardless of caste, gender, or background, honest living, and selfless service to others. Following Guru Nanak, Sikhism developed through a line of 10 human gurus, concluding with Guru Gobind Singh in the early 18th century, who established the Guru Granth Sahib, a sacred scripture, as the eternal and final spiritual authority within the Sikh tradition, rather than passing leadership to a further human successor. Sikhism emerged during a period of significant religious and cultural interaction between Hindu and Islamic traditions in the Indian subcontinent, while developing its own distinct theology, practices, and identity. 7 traditions. Different centuries. Different regions. Different languages, texts, and practices. And yet, looking back across this entire journey, from fear of thunder in the deep past, to spirits in rivers and trees, to gods with names, to philosophers asking how we ought to live, it's possible to see each of these major world religions not as separate from that long history, but as part of its continuation, each one, in its own time and place, offering its own answers to questions humans have been asking for a very, very long time. In the next part of our journey, we'll step back even further, away from any single tradition, and ask what modern psychology, anthropology, and neuroscience have to say about why belief itself has remained such a constant, enduring feature of human life. Traveled a long distance in this journey, from the first flicker of imagination in the early human mind, to temples, mythologies, philosophies, and the great world religions practiced today. But one question remains, sitting quietly beneath everything we've covered. Why has belief endured, in some form, in nearly every human society ever studied? In this part of our journey, we turn to modern science for possible answers. Why does religion exist in every civilization? Anthropologists have long observed that some form of religious or spiritual belief appears in nearly every documented human culture, past and present, a level of consistency that few other human behaviors share so broadly. This consistency has led researchers across several fields to ask, is there something about the human mind, or human social life, that makes belief in the supernatural a near-universal feature of our species, rather than a coincidence of separate cultural histories? There is no single, universally agreed-upon answer. Instead, several overlapping explanations have been proposed, each offering a different piece of the picture. The psychological perspective. From a psychological standpoint, researchers have pointed to several features of ordinary human cognition that may make religious belief feel natural or intuitive. We explored one such idea earlier in our journey, the hypothesis that the human mind is inclined to detect agency or intention behind ambiguous events. Related research has also examined how children, across very different cultures, appear to develop early, intuitive beliefs about purpose, intention, and an afterlife, sometimes before being explicitly taught specific religious doctrine. Psychologists studying this area generally emphasize that these tendencies don't prove or disprove the truth of any religious claim. They simply suggest that certain kinds of belief may align closely with how human minds naturally tend to process the world. The anthropological perspective. Anthropologists have often focused less on individual cognition and more on religion's social function, the roles it plays in binding communities together. Shared belief, ritual, and religious identity have historically served to unite communities around common values, shared moral expectations, and a sense of collective identity, functions that may have offered real social advantages to groups that shared them, regardless of the specific content of their beliefs. Anthropological research also highlights how religious institutions have historically helped transmit cultural knowledge, moral norms, and social structure across generations, a function distinct from, though related to, religion's spiritual or theological dimensions. The evolutionary biology perspective. From an evolutionary standpoint, researchers have proposed several hypotheses for why religious belief and behavior might have persisted across human history. Some researchers propose that religious belief may be, in evolutionary terms, a byproduct of other cognitive traits that were independently useful for survival, such as agency detection, pattern recognition, or social reasoning, rather than something that evolved specifically because belief itself was advantageous. Other researchers propose more direct explanations, such as the idea that shared religious commitment may have historically strengthened group cohesion and cooperation, offering practical advantages to communities bound together by shared belief and ritual, particularly in times of hardship or conflict. It's worth being clear that these remain competing, debated hypotheses within the field, rather than a single settled scientific consensus. The neuroscience perspective. Neuroscience has, in more recent decades, begun examining what happens in the brain during religious or spiritual experience, prayer, meditation, ritual, and altered states of consciousness. Researchers using brain imaging have observed that certain religious and meditative practices are associated with measurable changes in brain activity, including regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and, in some studies, a reduced sense of boundary between self and surroundings during deep meditative or contemplative states. This research describes what happens in the brain during these experiences. It does not, and cannot, determine whether such experiences reflect an encounter with something beyond the physical brain, or are fully explained by brain activity alone, a question that remains, appropriately, outside the scope of neuroscience itself. Belief improves survival? This is a genuinely debated question among researchers, and the honest answer is, it depends on what, specifically, is being asked. Some research has suggested possible associations between religious practice and certain measures of well-being or longevity, though researchers caution that such associations are complex and may be explained in part by related factors, such as social support, community connection, or lifestyle patterns, rather than belief itself in isolation. At the level of entire societies rather than individuals, some researchers propose that shared belief systems may have historically supported large-scale cooperation among otherwise unrelated individuals, a significant challenge for early large societies to solve. Again, this remains a debated hypothesis, not a settled conclusion. Why do rituals reduce anxiety? Across many different cultures and belief systems, ritual behavior, repeated, structured, often symbolic action, appears connected to reduced anxiety, particularly in situations involving uncertainty or lack of control. Some researchers propose that rituals' structured, predictable nature may offer a sense of order and control in the face of uncertainty, regardless of whether the ritual itself has any direct causal effect on the outcome being sought. This idea echoes something we explored much earlier in our journey, the ancient human tendency to seek explanation and a sense of agency in the face of the unpredictable. Why do communities form around shared belief? Shared belief offers something practical and powerful, a common framework of meaning, values, and expectation that can unite people who might otherwise have little in common. Religious communities, throughout history and today, often provide social support, mutual aid, and a sense of belonging alongside their spiritual or theological dimensions, functions that may help explain why religious communities have remained such durable, resilient social structures across human history. Science can offer us partial answers to why belief has been such a constant thread through human history. Insights from psychology, anthropology, evolutionary biology, and neuroscience, each illuminating a different piece of a very old, very human puzzle. But science, by its nature, stops short of answering the deeper question underneath all of this, whether any particular belief is, in fact, true. That question belongs to philosophy, to faith, and to each person, individually, to consider for themselves. In the final part of our journey, we'll look forward to how belief and the search for meaning might continue to take shape in a rapidly changing modern world. Began this journey over 300,000 years ago, with a mind just beginning to imagine, in a world it could not yet explain. We've followed that mind through fear, through ritual, through spirits in rivers and gods with names, through temples and philosophies and the great religions practiced by billions of people today. Now, in this final part of our journey, we arrive somewhere unfamiliar to all of that history. Here. Now. The present. Artificial intelligence. We live, today, in a world beginning to grapple with a new kind of question, one earlier generations never had to consider. As artificial intelligence grows more capable, some people have begun asking what this might mean for belief, meaning, and even spirituality itself. Some researchers and religious thinkers have started exploring these questions directly, how different faith traditions might understand consciousness, creation, or the soul in light of increasingly capable artificial systems. These conversations remain very much ongoing, without clear or settled answers, and different religious and philosophical traditions are approaching them in different ways. Space exploration. Space exploration, too, has quietly reshaped how some people think about humanity's place in the universe, a question religion has addressed, in one form or another, since the very beginning of our story. As humanity has looked further into the cosmos, discovering the scale of the universe, the possibility of other worlds, the vast stretches of time involved, some have found this deepens existing religious conviction, while others have found it reshapes or challenges their sense of humanity's significance. Both responses appear across different individuals and traditions, without one being more common or more valid than the other. Digital communities. The rise of digital connection has also changed how religious community itself takes shape. Online spaces now allow people to practice, discuss, and share belief across enormous distances, connecting individuals with shared faith traditions who might never have found one another in the physical world. At the same time, some researchers and religious leaders have noted that digital community differs in important ways from traditional, in-person religious gathering, raising open questions about what may be gained and what may be changed as religious life increasingly moves into digital spaces. Scientific discovery. Scientific understanding continues to expand rapidly in cosmology, biology, neuroscience, and beyond. As we explored in the last part of our journey, science can illuminate a great deal about why belief exists and how the human mind engages with it, without settling the deeper question of whether any particular belief is true. This relationship between science and religion has taken many different forms throughout history, sometimes framed as conflict, but just as often approached, by many scientists and religious thinkers alike, as complementary ways of engaging with different kinds of questions altogether. Spirituality without organized religion. In recent decades, particularly in some parts of the world, researchers have observed a notable rise in individuals who describe themselves as spiritual without necessarily identifying with organized religious institutions or traditions. This shift reflects, for many people, a continuation of the same underlying search we've traced throughout this entire journey, for meaning, connection, and a sense of something beyond the purely material, even as the specific forms that search takes continue to change and diversify. Will humans always search for meaning? We end, finally, where we more or less began, with a question rather than an answer. Across 300,000 years, human belief has taken an extraordinary number of forms. Fear of thunder. In trees, ancestors remembered, gods with names, temples of stone, philosophies of ethics, and the great religious traditions practiced around the world today. Whether this search continues, in some form, for as long as humans exist, or whether it changes into something we cannot yet imagine, remains a question none of us can answer with certainty. But if the last 300,000 years are any guide, the search itself seems unlikely to simply stop. For tens of thousands of years, humans have looked into the darkness and asked the same questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here?